Good afternoon and welcome to this session where we're going to look at how the decisions we can make in business and the practices of farmers can improve the planet that we all depend on. Before we dive into our session with our panel today, we'd just like to get a sense of our audience, and if I could just ask by kind of show of hands, what type of companies are represented? So we'll think about companies with direct farming operations, food processing, and consumer-facing brands. So if you could just show hands if you've got any farming operations, any food processing, consumer-facing brands. Okay. And of course, if you didn't fit into one of those categories, you're still very welcome. And when we move on to our audience questions, it'll be great to kind of broaden our perspectives as well. And my second question to you is, as we talk about regenerative agriculture, personally or your company, where do you join us today? Are you exploring this for the first time? Are you familiar and embedding this into a business? Or are you looking to really expand it as your heartland? So by show of hands, exploring, embedding, expanding, and a few still to decide. That's okay. Great. Well, that gives us a really good read so we can direct the answers we give and enjoy the discussion together. So I'd now like to hand over, first introduce myself. I'm Ben Summers, I'm Sustainability Manager at Innocent Drinks, with a keen responsibility for sustainable agriculture. So I'm really interested to hear what our panel have to say and the discussions that come up through the audience as well. And if I could just hand over to the panel to introduce yourselves, the organisations you're from and your roles briefly. Diana, can we start with you?
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. So I founded Partners in Purchasing 30 years ago as a management procurement organisation in hospitality and food service, leading on ethical buying, CSR and ESG practices. So to one extent or the other, we've been engaged with that agenda with all of our clients.
Mark?
Thanks, Ben. Mark Machin, I'm from Soil Association Certification. We're an accreditation body and a subsidiary of Soil Association Charity, charity campaigning for sustainable food farming, land use and healthy diets.
Hi, I'm the co-founder of The Ethical Butcher, which was set up really to be the place where I wanted to be able to buy meat from, having the impact that I thought meat should have, which is positive.
Thanks, Glen. So to get us kind of in the room together, I'd just like us to start by framing what as a panel we mean by regenerative agriculture. And Glen, could you start by sharing your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I think for me, the most important thing when trying to describe what it is that it's a result, not a prescription. And it can be described in many ways. It's often referred to as a rehabilitation approach to farming. So, but it employs a lot of different methods, but it's about the result that's achieved is often more important than the methods that are employed. And the results, what we're talking about, is increased soil carbon, increased soil fertility, an improvement in how water is cycled through the farm. And it's really about looking at how nutrients are returned to the land. And when done correctly and when done positively, it can be a net loss of carbon. A net loss of atmospheric carbon can occur through the best case scenario.
Great, thank you. I really like that language about kind of rehabilitation, but with results, making it tangible. Yeah. Mark, do you agree with that? Anything to add? I mean, to be regenerative, do you have to be organic as a precursor?
No, not at all. I think I agree with everything that Glen said. Systems are very important, but ultimately outcome is key. Taking a step back, I'd talk about what the problem is, which I think many people who might be listening today may be aware of on a general level. We have a critical problem in our food and drink sector. We will really struggle to offset to address a carbon issue, the carbon crisis, the climate crisis, because the industry we're in, food and drink, really struggles with our scope 2 and 3 emissions.
Yep.
This is absolutely critical, and it's something that that the agricultural system that we buy from can be a positive solution. It doesn't have to be a negative. A negative one for food and drink brands. So that regenerative, whatever it might be, regenerative, agroecological, agroforestry, organic, climate, nature, climate positive farming. These are lots of different terms which brands, manufacturers should be aware of. At whatever stage of journey they're on, any small steps they'd be taking to have a positive impact, doesn't really matter what it is. Anyone can go the whole hog, but small steps are also really important.
And I want to pick up on some of those sort of small and first steps that we can take later. Before we do that and really dive into how the decisions we can take can be positive for the planet, I just want to think about how regenerative agriculture can help our businesses, to help the food industry. And Mark, I wonder if you could just share with us some of the consumer insights you've seen in this space.
Yes, so sustainability creeps up on the agenda, and the good news is we don't have to just be altruistic. There is a business case to be made here.
Yeah.
Kantar data has shown that 92% of consumers are willing to pay more money for what they can identify as a sustainable brand. Which is great, and there's lots of other consumer shopper insights that are showing this is a trend that's here to stay. This is not a flash in the pan. We've seen this for a few years, and the other Kantar data, which is showing this emergence of consumers that might be described as food citizens or eco-actives, is going to grow and will continue to grow. Probably represent about 60% of consumers who will self-identify as being eco-shoppers by 2030. It's fine. Right. It's insights, but the hardcore data, which backs that up, and I can talk from an organic perspective on the numbers. Organic market has continued to grow for the last 10 years, and as food and drink sales have plateaued in 2021, organic continues to grow at 5.2% in the last 12 months. So the consumer insights is very well, but the numbers really do stack up. Okay. Sustainable brands continue to grow where others may be stagnating.
Thank you. And Diana, from a business-to-business perspective, in your kind of procurement role, what trends are you seeing in the decisions that are being making, the requests from clients and customers?
Well, thank you. It's really interesting, actually, because what we are seeing is a real polarization of ideas. So on the one hand, as Glen described, we're getting a move away from monoculture. So a move away to regenerative agriculture, more like a sort of traditional mixed farming scenario where biodiversity is increased, there is more vegetation, hedges, trees, wetlands being encouraged, and there's a crop rotation including animal species within that. So that's one strong trend. But then on the other side, there's, and this is specifically relevant with food manufacturing, where costs are squeezed. We're getting into we lead in the UK ultra-processed foods. So that's a situation where small micro products are included in the ingredients particularly actually in the vegan sector, to create mouthfeel, to create flavour, shelf life, etc., which is great because it means in a way we've got an extraordinary diversity of product, but on the other hand, the negative is that those ingredients are quite fragile in terms of sourcing, and they're difficult to pin down in terms of their ecological footprint, but also they are calorie rich but nutrient low. So we've got two sets of clients wanting, and consumer bases wanting two different things.
Thank you. And I guess turning our attention now to hopefully the first cohort of business decisions that you spoke of, where there is a call for kind of more richness and ingredients and products that are well sourced. Could you give us some sort of tangible examples of how farming can be good for nature and some of the regenerative practices in action?
Well, yes. I mean, if just really expanding it out, if we think of a sector which has enormous impact because it's got enormous scale and has moved away from monoculture, we can think of the almond nut production in California. So that is a vast production of 1.2 billion acres, which is probably about fifth, sixth generation of farming established. But the almond trees have been so water thirsty that actually it was Glen here mentioned that it's causing mini earthquakes in that area because the water depletion is so severe. So what I think is marvellous about the solution, and you can see the solution applied right across the rest of agriculture as well, is that they are introducing cover crops. So they're introducing mustard, for instance, is one of many of the crops that they're including, but they are growing cover crops, which is a new crop in the space between the trees, and that is increasing water retention. It's bringing the CO2 back into the earth. It's nitrogen fixing, so it's self-fertilizing. It's increasing the biodiversity, and most importantly, it's allowing pollination for the bees. So for the 1.2 billion acres, they have to import 8 billion bees. I mean, that is just phenomenal. So, any opportunity to improve nature by having a self-sustaining symbiotic relationship like that is a complete turnaround away from monoculture, and it's great to see that actually, to be honest, if you drive around the UK, you can see cover crops pretty much in every field nowadays, when that's a transformation that's taken place over the last, I would say, 5 years. Mark probably could vouch for that.
Yeah, the almond one's fascinating because to pollinate the trees, you need pollinators, of course. But the big problem that almond farms have is a particular type of wasp that will destroy the almond crop by laying inside it. So there's a real challenge for almond producers. They need the pollinators, but there's this particular pollinator they need to control in order to have a healthy crop. So agricultural systems that you're buying for it as an almond manufacturer or brand or whatever, it's absolutely crucial. It's a really good example.
I think it's, to me also shows the agriculture is an ecosystem, and there will be, if we do it sort of transactionally and just bring in 8 billion bees, and other problems may arise. Whereas if you stabilize that ecosystem, and then there's natural enemies as well as positive pollinators, and working in a symbiotic way. So great to see some of those steps being taken. I'm sure more to come in the sector as big as that. Glen, could you share some of your experiences with the farmers you've worked with as the ethical butcher? Some of their practices as kind of taking this buzzword and putting it into action.
No, there's something that really resonated when Diana was talking there. I didn't know about that method of cover crop in the almond trees, but it reminded me of something that one of the farmers I visited once said, which is he hates to see sunlight hitting bare earth because it's a waste of a resource. And really, the two greatest resources a farmer has, regardless of what they're producing, whether it's beef or wheat or anything, are sunlight and rainwater. And if you have sunlight hitting bare earth, you're missing an opportunity to put carbon into the ground. And so that I think it's just when you start thinking in different systems like that. This particular farmer, to me, is quite inspirational. He's got 2,500 acres in an 8-year rotation. So he's producing barley, wheat, oilseed rape, dairy, poultry, eggs, lamb and beef. And the farmers move around this 2,500 acre estate, all farming in another way, but they know what year the rotation is in. So the prep work is being done for whatever the next stage is. And I think it's when you were talking about the mustard under the almond trees, it reminded me of, they were telling me when they're coming to the last barley crop, they'll undersow. So the pasture's already growing before they're harvesting. So you're just never missing that opportunity to have photosynthesis do what it does. And photosynthesis turns carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates, and where we want that to stay is as much of it in the ground as possible. And that's the basis of this. I think farming should be stacked enterprise. It should be rotations. We need some fundamental infrastructure change for that to happen. But if we start thinking about sunlight and rainwater are our only resources that we need to produce food, and that brings us to a much more holistic way of thinking about how food's produced. And I think that will lead to regenerative practices.
Great. Thank you. I'm going to turn to you for questions in just a second, but closing kind of question from me would be, if our audience and businesses are sat here today wanting to take a step to encourage regenerative agriculture, Mark, what advice would you give for taking that first step? Where can we start in what is a complex areas we've been just exploring?
Hugely complex, and I think that it depends largely on the size, the capacity that business has. So, but there's not to say there's not a starting point for everybody, right? And if you're a large business, you have a dedicated role yourself as a sustainability manager looking at agriculture practices. But small businesses can do this as well. I think the starting point, I'd say, is just think about a policy. Something that's not set in stone. Create an agricultural policy for your brand. Just very top line. It doesn't have to be one pager. Where's your starting point? From there, and this has to be a live document because things change. Mm-hmm. The problems change. Whether there are a myriad of problems that we've spoken about today, but some may be more relevant to certain brands and may come more to the fore. So the pollinated one we've spoken about quite extensively. We may well come to a very critical point where we have a significant number of fruit stocks that are not being pollinated, and therefore that would have to step up within your policies, your agricultural policy. But within that, I think there is a space for clearly identifying what agricultural system you're sourcing from. So thinking about schemes such as organic, leaf, global gap. These are sort of integrated farm management schemes that you as a brand, which you may not have the resources to go out to farms, you may be importing products from the other side of the globe and therefore don't have that capacity to do that groundwork. Identifying very clear and deliverable solutions through accreditation is a viable option for smaller brands to sort of a shortcut to assurance.
Can absolutely see the role of policy and knowing what you want to stand for. But in terms of getting this done on the ground, we're going to need engagement with farmers, we're going to need participation, and some of these represent, let's be honest, maybe some significant shifts to how farming has been for the last 70 years of intensive, scale, specialisation, and what Mark, you were describing earlier was turning some of that around. Have you got any thoughts about how we can work with farmers on that beyond just kind of a top-down sort of this is the policy that we stand for?
It is quite hard because farmers get set in their ways, and it often takes somebody like me who's a complete outsider to come in and ask really stupid questions as to why do you do that when you don't need to, and there's some head scratching. But there has been this sort of prevailing attitude of to get more out, you put more back in, and to try and break that cycle of thinking, well, actually, if you step back and let nature do more, you can get more out as well. It's a hard shift for farmers to make, but a great example of this was a product that we innovated with. We were determined to sell the highest quality poultry raised without any soy in the diet, and it proved to be almost impossible. It took us 2 years to find a farmer who is willing to try and keep chickens in a very natural way without any soy in the diet. And I spoke to feed mills, chicken nutritionists, that's a job, all kinds of different people who said modern breeds of chicken won't grow without the amino acids in soy. And eventually it took a beef farmer who worked out that the chickens could get the amino acids by following the beef around a rotational grazing system from the insects on the land. And that turned out to be an incredible innovation, and the chickens grew perfectly well. But it took a sort of outside approach to come up against a solution that we were getting brick-walled on. Sometimes it's about charging a premium. So if we can say our produce is regenerative and the gold standard to us is organic regenerative, we'll charge a lot of money for it. And then my job really is to educate the public as to why they should be demanding this, why they should be paying more for it, and why they maybe should be eating better quality a little less often if that's an issue. So I think it comes from two ends. I believe if we get the public demand for this type of food, the farmers will produce what the public are asking for. I have a long history in advertising and editorial, and I've seen things that are very consumer driven. So I see the changes coming from the consumer, and then the farmers will follow suit.
I'd just like to, I think, as we start thinking about the consumer, open it up to our audience now for any questions that you may have.
Hi, thanks for that. You spoke at the very end there about consumer demand and almost about curating that. What role do you think government might have in stimulating the demand of the consumer and changing tastes and changing palates and what they want, if any?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I mean, one of the battles that we have is explaining to people what grass-fed means for us compared to what grass-fed means legally according to DEFRA rules. So there's an organisation called the PFLA, Pasture-Fed Livestock Association. I think they're now simplified to Pasture for Life. And the reason this organisation exists is because within DEFRA food labelling laws, there's a line that says if the diet of the animal was predominantly grass, that meat can be sold as grass-fed. So taken to an extreme form, you can have soy and grain-finished beef being sold as grass-fed in British supermarkets, and in fact Lidl were called out for it just last week. And grain-finished and 100% pasture-finished meat is a completely different product, different nutrients, different life cycle, different effect on the health of the animal, and different effect on our health. So the best thing that the government can do, in my opinion, is to tighten up definitions as to what we can and can't say about certain things. And then I believe consumer demand will drive from that. So there's a lot of people buying what they think is grass-fed beef, and it's not. It just simply isn't.
That's a 51% minimum commitment to be labelled as grass-fed. And it's going to be, regulation is important, but and what we've seen emerging from Ukraine in the last 3 weeks is that skyrocketing costs of cereal, wheat and barley, and it's going to be interesting to see how that impacts
the legal definition of grass-fed.
And actually pasture-fed or a higher percentage of pasture-fed may become more economically viable, and we're going to lose about 30% of our wheat and barley as a supply. We can plant more, yes we can, but that's not going to affect the price this year, maybe not next year. So regulation, really important, and there are lots of examples of other governments elsewhere in the world who are backing regenerative agroecological farming. Europe have got a very comprehensive policy in place to do that, and are seeing the benefits in increased levels of biodiversity. There's a fascinating study which I'd flag you towards by IDRI, the French Research Centre, which was entitled 10 Years for Agroecology in Europe, and it's it demonstrates that yes, we can quite clearly farm sustainably here in Europe and feed a European population, and obviously the environmental benefits that come from that. And EU, fantastic, they've done a fantastic job of putting policies in place. We are steps behind. We are the weak link in Europe, for sure.
I work with some companies that are pioneering innovative products to support a sustainable supply chain. So, for example, there's a company that captures CO2 from power stations, use it in bioreactors to produce a fish food for fish farms. What are some of the most interesting innovative technologies that are up and coming to support a sustainable supply chain?
To me, it's very, very simple. The most proven an effective at scale method we have of taking atmospheric carbon levels down is biosequestration. There is really no other way that we've got of removing carbon from the atmosphere than encouraging plant growth. It's as simple as that. So, all these incredible machines that can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere and turn them into concrete and things like that, all we need to do is farm in a way that gets more roots into the ground. We need to work on drilling, not tilling methods, so we're not churning the soil up every year to put a new crop in. And simply work with nature to biosequester as much carbon as we can. It's not about some crazy scientific innovation. It's about actually looking back and working more with natural systems. And when I say natural systems, I mean systems that include plants and animals in the same place. I mean, you gave a great example of a monocrop that isn't a monocrop. That's how we should be thinking about all of our farming systems. That was a great example of sequestration.
I can just add to that, to your situation. When I was in New Jersey, I saw a really interesting tilapia CO2 circular system by growing tomatoes. So the tomatoes were grown.
It's aquatic permaculture.
Aquaponics.
That's it.
Aquaponics.
Aquaponics.
Yeah.
That's it,
So it's a fantastically
closed loop system, right?
Closed loop system. So the tomatoes produce CO2 within the closed. They use O2 during the day. Then they exude CO2. O2. The O2 goes into the fish farming as well as the heat. So that species benefits from that. Then they actually added on a wormery. So the worms were digesting the waste, and then the juice, the waste of the worms was the nutrient for the tomatoes. So it was just a wonderful use of energy, waste, and gas.
We have a slightly different stance at Soil Association on aquaponics. I think not to say it's not right, but from our perspective, as much as Glen identified, the solution is beneath our feet. Soil is the best sequester of carbon, better than air, better than the ocean. Meta analysis shows that if the UK went organic tomorrow, it'd be the equivalent of removing 1 million cars from our roads. Soil is absolutely fantastic. Come back to our top line discussion for today. Regenerative agriculture. If you can identify that in your supply chains, you'll be making an absolute. I appreciate it's not a new innovation. It's an old innovation.
Yes.
Thank you. This is a great discussion. Really appreciate everyone's story. So one question that you mentioned before, Glen, about really where you were listening to farmers and saying, well, what solutions have they come up with to do soy-free chicken? Yep. What other, are there many examples of organizations really engaging farmers and listening to farmers at scale in order to help the transition towards a more regenerative, organic agricultural system?
I mean, I would say that the largest, Nestle, Unilever, they're all doing amazing work in cover crops, in increasing biodiversity and moving away from monoculture. And clearly, because they're such large consumers, both in food service and with consumers, a small adjustment that they make to their agricultural system has an enormous effect in terms of the actual ecological footprint impact that they're making. And, Cargill, Danone, etc. I think, I don't know if anybody was in the previous session, but these large organisations are like tankers. They're
slow to move.
They're slow to move, and their rate of change is small. But when they do make change, and obviously it needs to be well considered, the impact is enormous. And I know this is something close to Ben's heart, but they're also making really important changes in terms of managing labour, building community, making sure that slave labour is eradicated.
And Thank you. I guess if I can break the rules as the chairperson and just respond a little bit to that question. It's a question that I feel keenly in my role at Innocent. And I guess a couple of the approaches we've taken, and we've not got this cracked yet, but first is we have something called our Farm Innovation Fund, which is like a prize fund where the message is you have the passion, the experience, the skills with these solutions. Pitch your idea to us rather than me come to you with, here's the next policy, the next trend, and we will support that idea with, in kind, with our network and the experts we can bring around that if that's helpful, and of course with a large kind of cash investment to get the project up and running. And then some of the other things we do, kind of a bit more smaller projects, is to build in the business case for the farmer. So we're doing some studies in apples and orange in Spain, looking at how we can protect and promote pollinator populations, because without those pollinators we don't have fruit. And one of our key performance measures is not just the health of the pollinators, it's what's that doing to yield, what's that doing to quality. And we know at the moment, status quo, those orchards are 17% lower than what their maximum theoretical yield could be. So if we introduce wildflowers, if we introduce a better pesticide management plan, can we close that 17% gap? And that cash is for the farmer. And hopefully that cash then encourages like reinvestment for new things in the future.
Thank you. So is that an Innocent program, the Farmer Innovation, or
yes, with our farmers and suppliers, of course. It's about partnership. Were there other questions? Did you have a question? Did we cover it already?
Hi. Yeah. Maybe it's a little bit controversial, but do you think being a little less damaging is enough? Do we not even need to contemplate getting rid of some sectors, some sectors of the shopping aisle we don't actually need? We don't need wipes, for example. We can use tissue paper. We could eradicate a big problem with that. So let's not talk about less damage, just take the category out. We don't need little plastic stirrers for our coffee. Just take the category out. Let's, through policy shift, through consumer acceptance of policy shift, we're going to have to take some sectors out. About 5 years ago, we stopped buying greeting cards in our house, and now we just make little cards and put them in envelopes we've made. It takes a few minutes, saves us £3.50 a go, and it's taken another sector out, a sector we no longer need, actually. So I want to be a bit revolutionary about it, push it harder, really, and say let's not reduce the damage we're causing, let's take out the damage and take out some of the sectors that are causing us the problem in the first instance.
That's really interesting, but all the things you mentioned are things that we can live without, and we can't live without food. And food is very emotive, it gives us pleasure as well as sustaining us, and we need to eat. And when you start getting into trying to remove entire food groups, I believe you compound problems in other places. It's, because we are, arguably we are natural omnivores, we certainly can eat both plants and animals, and we really should be looking at the most efficient ways we can of feeding ourselves with food security for where we live. But a really important thing is when you start digging into this a bit more, these guys I'm sure are better clued up than this about this than I am, but you can often get caught out by thinking a decision is better than another. And a great example of this is I looked into the difference between a bottle of Chilean wine and a bottle of French wine in a UK supermarket. And the Chilean wine was pressed in Chile, shipped over in a 20,000 litre shipping container, bottled in the UK and transported in mass to a UK supermarket, had a lower carbon footprint than a bottle of French wine that was bottled in France. So sometimes you can think by avoiding mass importation, you're making better choices, and you're just simply not. If you get in your car and drive to a farm shop to get your grass-fed steak, you've nullified the advantage that animal had in the way it was produced. This is so complex, it's so nuanced, and it's not black and white. I think the most important thing is that we keep thinking about the decisions we're making in an educated way.
Your question does, though, link into an early question we had about regulation, because I think would I be quite so eco-active as you're leading to? I think probably not, for very similar reasons to what Glen's mentioned. But if market demands do not bring about change soon enough, then yes, we do need to a firmer steer, which probably comes from policy and regulation, because the problems are imminent. We know we have probably around 60 years of topsoil left. No topsoil, forget it. There will be no plant-based diet because there's no topsoil left. We've lost 98% of our wildflower meadows. Again, that's a pollinator, that's a biodiversity crisis. The problems are imminent. We've spoken of lots of ways we can be positive and change change that through positive engagement with our agricultural systems. Would I blanket ban? Probably not, because I think palm oil is my good example of this. Palm oil is very, very destructive. Palm oil is bad. Well, maybe not. If you're getting rid of palm oil, what are you going to replace it with? There are other very negative plant-based fats that are not farmed responsibly. I'm not saying that there's a huge problem with palm oil.
It's very efficient, right?
It is very efficient,
yeah.
And potentially could be farmed very effectively. But to ban it opens up the door to another problem. I see exactly where you're coming from, and I think we probably do need something that moves things faster. But a blanket ban needs consideration on it's a very it would need some serious forethought on, and would be very sector and product specific.
If I can come back on that, because it's
Sure.
quite an interesting subject for me. But the difference between almost system one thinking and system two thinking in everybody's mind is, in the cold light of day, we might want to buy certain products, but when we're in front of the fixture and we've got all the demands of the kids around us and the car on, outside and need to get back to work and all the rest of it, you reach out and you get the cheapest or the prettiest or the quickest or the easiest, and you put it in the bag, and then you get home and you think, how the hell did I buy that? That's not what, in the cold light of day, I wanted to buy. But my system one thinking has overtaken my system two thinking. System two thinking is almost through my own policy and government policy. It's when we're at our most serious and sensible. When I'm in front of the fixture, I can't rely on myself to actually make the right decision.
Sure. And
yet
retailers and brands have an area of responsibility.
Right.
Diana mentioned it earlier. We have a very disproportionate percentage of our diets here in the UK is from highly processed food. This is a bit of an aside, it's a bit of another conversation. But you're right. Retailers and brands do have responsibility on that front, and I think that comes back to our overall conversation: is how you can take responsibility as a brand to have a positive impact.
I think the other aspect is that, unfortunately, and procurement is partly to blame with this, we've constantly pushed for cost. What is the cost? What is the cost of this? What's the cost of that? Instead of thinking, what is the value of this? And again, in the previous session, the Nestle spokesman said, we are constantly looking at the value chain. And I have to say, they're immensely successful because, yes, they're looking at value chain, yes, they're making improvements, and yes, their products are pretty accessible in terms of price, as accessible as many. Well, they have filled the world with plastic bottles, and that's a lovely debate, that one, because the reality is probably our biggest commodity that we rely on as consumers, every single one of us, in many different ways, is oil. It's our biggest commodity, and we are using it everywhere. And it's so endemic I'm sure we're probably all wearing some plastic. I'm sure we've got plastic in our handbags. I'm sure we've used it 1,000 times in our journey here today and will do for the rest of the day. To pull plastic out of the system and to pull oil products out of our system is phenomenal.
And just to bring us back onto sort of the opportunities around regenerative agriculture, I guess what I'm hearing is, let's focus that on core value chains which have purpose, are here to stay, hopefully. And you mentioned kind of oil, and we're branching out into climate change there. Wondered if you could expand on a comment on carbon and how regenerative agriculture can contribute to climate action, and where are there maybe some trade-offs for, are they taking us down different pathways?
Yeah, I think from a procurement perspective, that's quite a granular conclusion in each products area. And I can't respond. I'm sure that Mark and Glen would have a different perspective. I don't want to generalise. What I would say from a procurement perspective is I would encourage procurement professionals to be really interrogative about all the aspects of the things that they're buying and how they're sourcing, just making sure that there's a format of tenants that they're optimising opportunity for water, biodiversity, soil regeneration, carbon sequestration, nitrogen. I wouldn't like to say, perhaps in the same way as we've said, it's not a great idea just to eradicate something, because everything is holistic and they work together. So I would encourage procurement to take a holistic approach, and most importantly, get the NPD team and their finance team on board to those decisions, so that they're re-educating their organisations to think about value, not cost.
Okay. Thank you. It's been a really kind of whistle-stop tour on a very complicated topic, but I would say a massive thank you to Glen, Diana and Mark for your contributions on the panel. Thank you to the questions we've had in the audience as well, and I'm sure some of us are staying around afterwards if you'd like to talk any further.